Hello and welcome to the Empowering Women podcast. I am so super pumped for today's episode. So at our 2023 Empowering Women in Industry conference, I had the amazing opportunity to moderate a panel on gender equality. And my guess is that all of you were sadly not in attendance. So we decided to share round two with you. We have two fabulous guests today. Our first guest is Daryl Anne Estill. She is an experienced project manager and leader in the commercial MEP construction industry. She's also a public speaker, a mentor, and an industry leader, and her advocacy work focuses on women in construction, industry, gender equity, and then equity in general. And then we're also very blessed today to have Miss Jill Miller with us, who is the founder and CEO of Lunan. It's a company that provides supplier impact data and insights to Russell 1000 companies to help them make purchasing decisions to better alignment with their values and their long-term business strategy. She is a passionate, and I can account for that, passionate entrepreneur and thought leader with a focus lies in economic mobility, entrepreneurship, decent work, and economic growth in the United States. Welcome, Daryl Anne and Jill. It's so good to see both of you.
So good to see
Thank
you.
you. Great to see y'all.
Thank you.
All right, so I'm going to do a little caveat. Jill has had a business emergency today, so we are going to do at least 30 minutes with both of them, and then Jill may have to drop, but you will have Daryl Anne and I to finish you out if that so happens. So we appreciate the patience. Life happens, and we roll with it. That's what us women leaders do. So I want to start where I always start. I want to hear more about each of your stories. So Jill, I'm going to start with you, and then Daryl Anne will roll to you. So Jill, tell us about how you get where you are today.
Oh boy, never a straight line. So I spent about 20 years in industrial business development, mostly factory floor automation, engineered plastics, and driving efficiency for a lot of big brands and organizations. And in 2021, I hung up my steel toes after I realized that companies were pledging all this money to drive change for women and people of color. And I didn't really I was traveling a lot in 2020, and I actually didn't see that occurring. So I left what I was doing and I started asking leaders, like, how are you going to spend that money? Like, how are you going to make change? And it was like, I got a plan to have a plan to have a plan. So on that note, we built Lunam so that companies and brands can start to translate their impact of their business decisions around people into dollars and really understand how they're creating inequities or how they're resolving inequities for people.
Which is amazing. We need so much more of that in this world, which is why, Jill, I love what you're doing. I think you and I had early conversations as you were ramming things up. It's fantastic.
Yeah.
And you go look that up. I will put link to Lunam in the show notes. Highly encourage you to go look her company up. All right, Daryl Anne, give it to us. What's your story?
I love what Jill said, that it's never a straight line, right? Little bit less traditional approach into the industry. I did not go to college. I'm not necessarily college educated, but I started in the industry at 19 years old and fell in love with the workmanship, the craftsmanship, the pride that goes into it, and the just the sheer amount of expertise that's required to, build infrastructure, to build buildings, to make them safe, to make the environment welcoming, or, to make the water hot or the air comfortable. And so I started in the construction industry at about 19 years old. I came in through the administrative pathway and just started spending as much time as I could with the estimators, the project managers, the field guys, was asking to go on field walks. And before I knew it, I was, pricing up change orders and doing red line drawings. And from there, I just never looked back and had the wonderful opportunity to kind of jump out of the architectural side of construction and move to TD Industries, which is where I'm currently at now, and been here since 2011 and have focused and specialized on MEP, anything from process piping to, HVAC systems, plumbing systems, all the way from multifamily to semiconductor. And so I love everything about it. And I love being on the project management side because I kind of get to touch a little bit of everything, from financials to contracts to customer interaction and business development, all the way to still, Jill, like I haven't hung up my steel toes yet. I still got this.
I haven't either. I wear them all the time.
Right. I know I wear my work boots out sometimes. And my husband's like, you're not at work. And I'm like, that wasn't the question.
Right.
So
yeah, I shout out to Juno Jones. I have the cherry bomb boot.
Yeah.
So yeah,
I
there
have
you
Juno
go.
Jones and
Jones.
Zeno's.
Juno Jones, and there was that brand that was there last year that had the really cool, like low back steel toes that I really want to. So those are on my list for next purchases. And then I'd say, similar to what Jill said, is as I'm coming up through the ranks in the industry myself as a woman, I started to notice that my own experience had obstacles, it had barriers, it had frustrations beyond the normal frustrations. And that really got me interested into understanding how this impacted others. And so now I'm just super fortunate to be a part of organizations like Empowering Women in Industry, to be connected with amazing people like Jill, who run their own organizations based on equity and gender equity. Shannon, who is a leader and an award winner in the DE&I space. And I get the chance to research and do public speaking and advocacy work and mentorship work in the community and with women in our industry. And so that's where I am today. I love my job, and it gives me the opportunity to do the passion work on the side. So,
yep. I will say really quickly, we are definitely a group of very different but aligned people. And I think that's what you find at Empowering Women in Industry. So a huge shout out to Charlie on that one.
Yeah.
always.
I'm going to go ahead and get to the next question because I want to make sure that Jill gets some of this data in here. So at the 2023 conference, Jill and her team shared some data around the demographic breakdown in the U.S. producer manufacturing industry. What did women advancing in seniority look like? Some living wage equities. So Jill, if you don't mind, dig into one or all of those or whatever you have readily available, because I believe you did some updates. You and your team did some updates.
So we did some
time.
updates, and we're going to do more in one of the mentorship circles coming up. So this is a teaser leaving you wanting more.
There you go. I like it.
So what I'll say is our database at Lunam, we have data on, I'll just take the Russell 3000, which is about 3,000 of the largest US companies. And when we look at, what we look at is what are the wage inequities, whether it's adequate wages, wage equity, overpayment to a specific group. Then we look at like representation to the local population. We look at promotion rates and jobs and seniority levels. So when we add up all the inequities in those 3,000 companies across about 19 million workers in the US, we find like a $1.3 trillion opportunity. There's $1.3 trillion of inequities essentially that are unnecessary that we can improve on. So
Trillion with a T.
Trillion with a T. And I'll add, there was a Gallup poll recently that talked about there is also a $1 trillion attrition problem in the United States that is voluntary and mostly avoidable. So when I match those, I look at it and I think, wow, like, I'm glad everybody's making record profits, but there are some of us that need a little help down here. So when we look at like producer manufacturing for gender and ethnicity, so women in general make up about 47% of the US workforce, only 30% in manufacturing. So we've held steady in this like 1/3 group. And then when you look at women of color, they're like 7%, which is really crazy. And I'll add that there's like a number of these like support the food and ag industry, and our data shows as far as ownership goes, like almost zero, like less than 1% of Black women are running or owning these companies in industrial America. And it just to me is appalling. Like, and women in general are less than 4%. So that's one of the problems, right? Like just not enough of us there, not enough of us moving through the ranks so that people who look like us continue to be there. And we only hold like less than 1/4 of the executive roles, despite having higher education rates than men. And men are promoted 30% at a 30% higher rate at the first step into management. So there are inequities and we can't continue to deny them. And then, the other piece, BLS put out, Bureau of Labor Statistics, in 2023 that women in manufacturing earn 73 cents for every dollar that men make in the same roles. And we only have 74% of the wealth that men do when we retire. These are issues.
Which is scary because women on average live about 5 to 6 years longer
Right.
than men, the statistics I've seen.
Right. Despite all what we go through.
Could be
Oh
longer.
gosh, we'll probably say that one for a different day. That might be a
Yes.
really fun podcast.
Yes.
That might be like a podcast after dark with some, some fun beverages maybe.
Those are some scary statistics. The ones about women of color really just, they continue to shock me. Unfortunately, they do, but they don't, because I see it every day in the workplace, but it's hard to hear the number like that. It really frustrates me.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious, Daryl Anne, how do you think we got here? Like, what do you think there are one or two factors that really come to your mind about how we got here?
Sure. And a lot of these questions, I'm just going to go ahead and preface this once because I could say it for each one. These are very big, loaded questions, right? And we're trying to consolidate some really big concepts and ideas down into 30 or 45 minutes. So just grace with trying to get that consolidation down. But I'd say, one of the big things that I talk about and was one of the big mindset shifts in my unlearning journey. I had to unlearn a lot of stuff that we're taught societally to make room for new learning is when we talk about gender pay gap and gender inequality, any inequality really, we have to stop thinking in terms of the individual. It is not the individual's fault that they are not making as much money, they are not as successful and define success in these terms with, being a working individual in a capitalistic country, right? Success looks like making enough to have a livable wage and affording healthcare and things like that. And it takes money. So women are not disadvantaged because they are less, or, that they are inferior. They're not as smart. They're not as talented. There's something else at work here. And for those that don't quite know how to put their finger on it, we're talking in terms of systems or systemic issues or systemic barriers that no matter how hard you work, you will continue to bump up against these seemingly invisible, intangible walls that create outcomes that Jill is talking about with the disparity in the data. So really getting your mind around, we need to stop talking in terms of individuals and talking in systems. And I bring that up because that's very intentional. We're here because it was designed for us to be here because of those systems. Systems are built out of intentional design. So when we think about things in terms of, like, a lot of folks have heard things like the gender pay gap we talked about just briefly and kind of on average. And of course, like Jill mentioned, the more intersectional you go, the more devastating those statistics look. But, a lot of folks have heard about the gender pay gap. And I think it was 2020, a Pew Research study said women on average have to work 42 days extra to close the gap. So I know we talk in terms of like the dollars and cents, but if you look into and kind of make it, remove the size and remove, things that maybe people can't conceptualize as much if they're not in finance or understanding numbers, is they understand what a full day's work is. And women have to work 42 extra days to close the gap. And that's just on average. That does not take into account any other intersectional identities. Also, I think Jill mentioned too, there really hasn't been any improvements or changes in the gender pay gap in almost 2 decades. We've seen no movement and no improvement, but we've seen a lot of discussions and a lot of chat about investing, and it's important and we need to do something about it, but we have not seen the outcome. So I said that to say, when you start diving into the kind of intricacies and everything that leads to a gender pay gap, which then leads to a gender wealth gap, you start running into things. And again, I won't go into every detail, but one of the things that struck me was when I learned about what's called the overlooked potential effect. And that basically looks at how folks are promoted within organizations. And right now, based on a 2019 study, I believe Yale did a research paper on it, and I can, Jill, I'll send you the study to put in the notes if you'd
Yeah,
like.
it'd be great.
They basically identified that men tend to be promoted based on potential, meaning they have the potential to go to the next level. They have the potential to step into leadership or to take on additional accountability or leadership roles. They have the potential to handle risk or anything like that, whereas women tend to be promoted based on demonstrated performance. And right there, before you even start talking about money, there's a huge gap. So that study found that women were somewhere around 7.5% more likely to be rated to receive a high rating than men. So they were actually being rated higher than men for performance, whereas men were rated higher, women were rated lower on potential by something like almost 6%. So when you look at that kind of on this spectrum of, okay, if we were equal, we'd kind of be at a net zero. So we're not just talking about the 7% gap on this side of women only being rated highly on performance. We're looking at the deficit between being rated on potential as well. They also found when they dug into it further that when women are rated lower on potential in their performance reviews, it can result in up to 50% of the gaps in promotions. So when Jill mentions just at that first level, men are promoted at a rate of 30% more at that first initial thing. These are some of the things that are contributing to that gap alone. But then there's next steps, right? There's other leadership levels that we're still not seeing or growing into. So when you kind of put this all together, these are just one or two examples of things that contribute to how we got here. And that doesn't even take into consideration like historical prevalence of racism, sexism, white supremacy, ableism, things like that. And so what Jill's work is doing is helping us take things that we've kind of known and talked about and bringing it into the future with data and statistics to back it up so we can no longer be told we're crazy.
Right. Well, and I think it's right. And our approach is how do we make it financial, a financial number, and consistent, comparable, and accurate?
Absolutely.
Because 100 years ago in this country and in the world, we didn't have standardized accounting practices, which led to the stock market crash. And 5 years later, we had GAAP accounting and the SEC. So now people know when you invest, you know what you're investing and what your return is. We need to do that with people. And I'll say one of the things that has been so eye-opening to me in the last few years with this is you have to be looking right through a telescope and through a microscope. And I think most of the data out there is very, very macro. And
True.
And we're even seeing it in large corporations where you see at ground level, like you might have 30 plants in the US and 6 of those plants perform amazingly, and then everybody else is a complete laggard. But by the time it gets to the CHRO, what they're seeing is, oh, it's going pretty well. And our overall turnover is 8%. And women are women trail men in turnover or attrition. But when you dig into it, you go, oh, well, that's because there were only 7 women to begin with and only 1 left. And there were 700 of men. And, and it's a really interesting way. And I think there's a significant problem in the way that we aggregate data to the macro level. And one of the things I love, and I always say, like, if I'm 90% right, like, let's do this, because we have to start looking at like, we are human beings. And yes, did we miss out on the Industrial Revolution and the ability to own things because we couldn't have a checking account until almost 51 years ago? Yes. But like, if we're going to make it up, we have to create the new system and just hospice the old one. So
Well,
yeah.
I always find it so fascinating that in our industry, like lessons learned, right? Or whatever you call it in your side of the industry, postmortems, lessons learned, when something goes wrong, we're really great at creating the 5 why and the root cause analysis. And we get down and we have the capability of understanding complex ideas, complex contributions to issues as it relates to production or quality or whatever, but yet somehow we magically lose those skill sets when we start talking about data around people. So I
And
find
you know
it
what
really
it is?
interesting that there's also a gap. The gap that we need to talk about is in the level of expertise that magically flies out the brain window in one ear out the other when you transform talking about business results and productivity and quality, and you start looking at people and then magically ignoring the data side of that that says there are actually better business results if you pay attention to these other things.
Well, you know what that is rooted in? That is rooted in accounting practices. When you
Oh, interesting. Say more, Jill.
when you build, right, your cost of goods, you have a line item for labor, and that line item is a cost. So it doesn't matter who the body is that's putting the lid on the, you know, on the container or doing the maintenance or whatever it is. It's a cost, and it's treated as a cost. And then as HR people, we're trained to keep costs low, not invest in our people. And this business case for workforce investments is elusive. And to your point, Daryl Anne, on the other side is we go out and we buy a $2 million machine, or we invest $20 million in a processing line. And you know what? Those are all assets, because there is an ROI built into those assets. And the more overall equipment effectiveness I get out of those assets, the more money I make. And I often say, we look at efficiency and effectiveness in the use of labor, and where you can improve as one of our metrics. We see, you know, like in manufacturing, it's not that high. I don't know it off the top of my head, but it's probably under 40%, maybe 45% efficiency or effectiveness when you look at, so that's 45 cents of every dollar is impactful, 55 cents is lost. If that was happening on a machine in your factory,
I know you just gave me heart palpitations when I was thinking about a machine like
you would
performing at
lose
that
your
rate.
mind, right? You
Yep.
would lose your mind. But we treat
Yeah.
people
Yeah.
on the balance sheet like a Post-it note. And until we move them and start looking at what we can do, and we know it's possible. I mean, you've seen it.
Yeah.
We're building data that's happening. We had one company who started working with us. They used our metrics for impact, started looking at the world through the lens of impact, because they did want to advance women. They wanted to have more diversity in leadership, all the things we're looking for. And then their general manager looked at me and said, like, I have like 80% of the people who start working here walk out the door within 90 days. And we were like, okay, well, so you can't do better because you're not doing better when it comes to the people that are being hired. So it was like you have a retention problem because you have an attrition problem, and you have a promotion problem because you have a retention problem. And when we went in, we dug in very quickly, spent some time with the employees who were turning over. Within 120 days, we knocked out most of that 90-day attrition. Hopefully it's sustainable. But we also increased throughput. We helped them increase throughput by 16% in 100
That's a lot in a short
days.
period of time.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. But it's 60. If you multiply 16% over the year, there is no reason you can't afford to invest in a few people. It's
Interesting.
What she said.
it's mind-boggling, as my kids would say. Sorry.
No, you're good. This is what I want, organic conversation. I'm going to ask one more question before Jill's got to run. So when we did the panel back in 23, it was called the Gender Equality Panel. But I think what we all three came to is this conversation is more about equity, and there's a difference. So I'm going to define it. So equality means each individual or group of people is given the same resources or opportunities. Equity, on the other hand, recognizes that each person has different circumstances and is allocated the resources and opportunities they need to reach that equal outcome. A very different conversation. I'm curious what equity means to each of you, and Jill, I'll start with you. And then how do you think we can encourage or create systems and processes to have more equity in our workplaces?
Wow. Okay. So
It's a tough one.
yeah, I mean, and in the US, it's, to me, like, equity for everybody is giving what people need when they need it, right?
Yeah.
And
Good way.
I think it's pretty easy to figure that out. But for me, the equity piece means like systemic adjustments. pay transparency, active sponsorship, data-driven, insight-driven decision-making that leads us from data, insights, knowledge across the bridge to wisdom that women are useful in an organization and we're worth investing in. And I'll say, you know, like, barring anything political, but like this whole conversation around inclusion, DEI, all of it, it's just like off track, right? It's completely off track. And the more and more I'm involved in sort of this chaos that doesn't have to be happening, the more I think that like we have to go out there and grab equity. We have to take it into our own hands and take what we deserve. I mean, right? You think about equity in terms of like investment. Like who goes out there and grabs it? It's not us, right? We need more of that. And the equity we get inside an organization or every day when we show up to work, just a little bit of that translates into closing those gaps financially. It's we have to, but I'm and I got a 5-minute extension. So
okay, perfect. Good. We're gonna keep Jill a little longer than I thought.
But I think it goes a little bit to this, like you mentioned, this first one through the door opens it for the rest. Like we have to bang the door down. Now, you know, I never recommend any violence or any of that. But what I also am coming to realize is as women or anyone, right? We also have to build our own ability to protect ourselves, nurture ourselves, grow ourselves, and know who we are. And then we go get what we want, right? Because then the gloves come off, so to speak. And if there's like one thing I think we need in terms of equity is like helping women to understand and that they show up every day as a whole human being and that they don't let that other stuff come in. And it's really hard. I mean, I
was getting ready to say that is so easy to say and so hard to do.
So hard. But I want to be minus in life, so I'm getting there.
Yeah, I love it. All right, Daryl Anne, what does equity mean to you, and what can we do to better create equity in our workplaces?
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to follow Jill because obviously this is literally like her area of expertise, but
Yeah.
I'll just build on what she's saying, right? So for me, and I have notes too, because I just want to be really intentional with my words because I think it's super important. So equity focuses on outcomes, not just getting people in the door, but what are the outcomes that we need to see that are equitable, and then we build towards that or we build with that, not starting at the beginning with checkboxes. So equity focuses on outcomes and it focuses on removing barriers. It also prioritizes accessibility. And there's a lot that everyone, women, but everyone can learn from disability advocacy experts in this area. But it prioritizes accessibility and it recognizes systems versus blaming individuals. We kind of talked about that already. It asks the tough questions and uses privilege and policy to serve, support, and empower the disenfranchised. So what Jill was mentioning earlier is examples of baking in equity into policies. So regardless of personal feelings or conscious or unconscious bias, there is a policy in place that serves the outcome of equity, regardless of the individual who is in the role to enact or not enact the leadership around that. And then there's accountability measures that holds them accountable to that policy. But also, like Jill said, it can't all be policy-based, but that is where the true protection lies. And it also doesn't hide behind like unconscious bias and diversity training as like the checkbox that you've done what you've come to accomplish. And it's not the only tool in the toolkit, but it truly enacts and replaces and combats old, tired, harmful systems with new systems through policy enactment. And then I think the second part of that question is, what are ways that we can encourage processes and systems that are more equitable? This seems a little kind of like rudimentary, elementary, but really is reading and educating and starting at home. So that looks like focusing on yourself, like Jill said, understanding yourself and kind of getting right with yourself, and a lot of healing. Because let's be real, there's a lot of healing work that has to be done with ourselves because of the harm that's been caused with the systems we've all grown up and been kind of indoctrinated into. And you have to do a lot of unlearning. And then you need to turn that reading and that education outward to understand experiences that are different than yours. Because if we can understand that as women, men have a different experience, and therefore, like, we need to be paid attention to, and we need to have equity, then we need to build that within ourselves. And I'm particularly talking to white women right now, or women that hold places of like extreme power and privilege, is we need to be able to then turn that same understanding. Oh, look at me, I'm a woman and I have this experience and it's different, and I have these harmful systems that create barriers. We need to be able to turn that outwards and say, I don't need to experience what Black women are experiencing. I don't have to understand it to believe them, to say that this is real for them. And I need to do everything that I'm asking men to do for us, for them, with their permission and with their autonomy and with their voices leading the charge. And then I also wanted to throw out there too, from like a corporate perspective, if you're really trying to enact changes, I'm always going to plug Jill. You need to be talking to somebody like Jill to understand the data to make better decisions. So that would be a great place to start. So organizations that are looking for tangible ways to make change, you need to be talking to Jill and her company, Lunam. If you are a DE&I practitioner, or you are in the corporate space and you care about diversity, equity, and inclusion, to Jill's point, I'm not going to dive too deep into the politics. We may see some language changes just so we can continue the fight without triggering highly emotional folks. That shocker are not the women in the room, but whatever. Anyways, Lily Zhang is an incredible DE&I leader, thought leader, expert, and they have crafted 2 different books specifically targeted towards people in organizations. The first book that they wrote is DE&I Deconstructed, and it was helping to kind of understand how we got here. And I think somebody mentioned it earlier, is like, there was a time and a place for certain things to happen, but we're kind of advancing past that now. And her follow-up book is Reconstructing DE&I, and it is a playbook for practitioners, and it is a playbook for folks, and it gives them tangible ways to do the things that Jill and Shannon and myself are talking about through an act. What does it mean when we say we need to have policy change? She tells you what policies to look at. She tells you how to identify inequity within those policies. So it's a great place to start. And then for those that I know are going to hear that, and it's going to go in one ear and out the other, if you're going to look at your policies, you're going to want to start with your hiring, your promotion, your performance, performance review, promotion, coaching, and mentorship policies kind of under that umbrella, but your hiring processes and your termination processes with your advancement processes. That's where you need to start. And the questions you need to ask yourself are they equitable? And if not, how do I make them equitable? And you're not going to be able to do that in a vacuum. You're going to have to lean on people that know more than you, that have different and diverse experience from you, so that they can look at it through the lens of equity where you might be blind. So
yeah, one thing that always shocks me is the number of organizations that don't actually talk to their employees about what do you feel like, do you show up to work and can you actually feed your family when you go home? Oh, no, I'm working 2 jobs in order to do that, would be the response in a lot of cases, maybe in up to 40% of frontline workers in the United States. These are like, we've made it so risk averse, like we're so risk averse in the C-suite that we forget that like people, every single, like we talk about like every bit and bite of data is a human life. That's somebody's kids being able to pay the bills, all these things. And I'm astounded when I read some of like, they'll share like, here's what we did previously. And at the end of the day, what you have to do is you have got to, and it's not going to change probably in our lifetimes, we have to deliver the business case for why investing in anybody in an organization is worthwhile. And that's, to me, that is, we have to meet the shareholders where they are. And
I think that's a good takeaway in general. You have to meet people where they are in this line of work, regardless, shareholders, your
all the way around
boss,
it.
your coworkers, everybody.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think there's, okay, I'm going to jump in 2 minutes, but like, can I do one, like, I would love to come back. This has been so fun. Can we do this like every week?
Yeah,
Finish
Jill,
up.
you're on my list of coming back.
You know, the one thing I'm going to say, right, it's International Women's Day coming up, which I think is awesome. So like we need to get out there and take action, like meaningful action. And one of the things you asked for a quote, so I'm going to give you my quote that is.
Oh yeah, because I did want to ask you before you leave, what is one piece of advice or quote on gender equity you'd want to leave with our audience? So you took it right out of my mouth, Jill.
Yeah, so
let us have it.
You know what, the last year or so, I actually have two. I'm going to say one first. Like, this is how I think for myself. I am a huge fan of like St. Joan of Arc. So it's like, I am not afraid, for I was born for this, right? That's
Ooh,
my
I like that
personal
one.
And the other one to like other people that I would give as a piece of advice is my favorite meme on Instagram is, why are you still sitting at a table that Jesus would have flipped over by now? Like, let's get stuff done. And it doesn't, right? Build a new table if you need to, but we have to do something differently. And we don't have to be angry, but we have to provide this constructive tension. And I think meet people where they're at also. So
yeah, I love that. I'm gonna go find that meme. I'm not seeing it, Jill. So I'm gonna go find one, put a link in the show notes.
Yeah, there you go. All right, perfect.
Well, Jill, thank you for your time. Good luck with your emergency. And Daryl and Anne and I are going to carry on.
Thank you.
Bye, Jill.
Sorry.
Well, Jill, as she left us.
Tension.
Oh, that's great.
I'm writing that down. Oh, my lights went
Constructive tension. We just got our master class.
There we go.
So Jill just alluded to this quote. Our listeners may not have caught it, but when we first talked about this panel a couple of years ago, when Jill and Daryl Anne and I were, talking about how we wanted to construct it, she said a quote that I still have written down. And she said, the first one through the door opens the door for the rest. And I was like, oh, wow, that's a good one. So the question I have for you, Daryl Anne, is how can each of us and our listeners advocate for one another?
Let's see. I wrote a couple things down on that. I mean, just a second. I want to find my place. I think we jumped out of order for a second.
Yeah, I'm going to give my secret one question 5, Daryl Anne.
There you go.
My secret behind the scenes.
Yep. We can cut that part out, or you can leave it in,
I like it. We leave it in. We show imperfection at its finest. There we go.
Yeah. So what are some ways that we can, advance and do stuff, good stuff? So some of the notes I wrote down that were helpful for me and that I've gleaned from others, we need to understand the difference between mentorship and sponsorship. And if you're not familiar with sponsorship, we need to get familiar with sponsorship, because I think mentorship takes up a big place in all these conversations, as it should, because mentorship does lead to more equitable outcomes. And men tend to get and be able to take advantage of mentorship a lot more than women do. But sponsorship is the act of somebody using and leveraging their position, their privilege. So they might be in rooms that you're not able to be in, and they will put their name on the line and say, hey, I think Shannon would be an excellent person for this, complex job. I think they would do a really great job of this. I think we need to give her the opportunity. Or, hey, we're thinking about expanding our team and growing. Before we look at hiring from outside, I think Shannon would be an excellent candidate to move up, and then we can look at backfilling her. That needs to be our strategic plan. So if you understand that, then you can ask for sponsorship the same way we've been taught to ask for mentorship. If it's not coming to us, we need to ask for it. If it's not coming to us, we need to ask to be sponsored. Let's see. Some other very small, these are small in the grand scheme of things, but some tangible ways, we know that women tend to get interrupted more than men. So as you're in a meeting and you notice this trend, it is perfectly acceptable to, like Jill mentioned earlier, you don't have to get angry. You don't have to kind of escalate the situation, but men in the room or women who do have that comfortability speaking or the privilege or the tenure, whatever that looks like, hey, great, great thought on that, but I want to bring it back to Shannon. Shannon, you started with your thought. I want to hear you finish. So learning the art of redirecting back to the person whose original idea it was is so powerful, because it again, it kind of goes back to that idea of sponsorship. If I sit there and I'm like, you interrupted me, I need the spotlight back, that could create negative perceptions that can continue on, even though it shouldn't, right? The person who interrupted should have the negative perception on them, not the person who was interrupted. But that art of leadership, regardless of your title, to say, hey, let's bring it back to Shannon, let's bring it back to Jill, let's bring it back to Daryl. They had a really great thought. Let's hear them finish. Like, thank you for that, but let's hear them finish. So identifying the patterns of women being interrupted or talked over is going to be really powerful, because then it creates additional visibility. And I also want to take a moment to note that not every person, not just women, but not every person is comfortable having the spotlight on them. Not every person is comfortable speaking out, whether that's because they're introverted or they've had negative experiences, whatever that looks like. Also getting right and tight with how to adaptably lead your team for their style of communication or their style of contribution. So if they don't want to be the spotlight, maybe don't always call them out in the meeting or redirect back in the meeting, but understand that you can go to them one-on-one and you can ask really great questions. And then maybe you can be the one to say, hey, I met with so-and-so. They had these great ideas. Let's chat through them, stuff like that. So just being adaptable and understanding there's different ways to contribute that don't always look like what we've been taught, which is, authoritative white men, So the last thing I'd say that's really powerful is you need to start recognizing in yourself first, when your perceptions of somebody else fall into certain categories. So if
Oh
I'm
man, is that tough? That is so tough when you start doing that and you start catching yourself.
Absolutely. But once you start, that's all
You
it
can't
takes.
unsee it at that point.
Once the snowball leaves the top of the hill, it's gone, right? And so I would encourage, it's easy to just summarize that as your perception starts to fall into categories of stereotypes. So for instance, if I'm speaking with a coworker and maybe their perception of me is, wow, she's kind of intense today, would you say the same thing of maybe a male counterpart? Would you have that same perception? If your perception is, wow, she's really emotional, that's a trigger word. Like, you need to be questioning yourself. Same thing, like, not just men, I'm not just talking to men, but me as a white person, if I'm talking to somebody of color, particularly a Black woman, and I have had ingrained indoctrinated racism in my head, and I notice maybe I'm like, wow, they're very abrasive. I need to stop myself. I need to pattern interrupt and say, where did that come from? Are they actually abrasive? What evidence do you have for that? Would you say the same thing for somebody else? And so learning and building that skill set, it's a muscle, it needs to be flexed. Stop, ask yourself if that's real or if it's a stereotype. If you can very easily say it's a stereotype, you probably should stop and reconsider. And especially, this is really important because those thoughts, if uninterrupted, translate to feedback, translate to
I also say give yourself grace, because the system has encouraged you maybe to think that way, and you have to unlearn things that you've maybe not even realized you've learned.
That's such a great point. It is again, it's particularly white people, but we're taught that, if you admit that you have any sort of isms, that you're a terrible person, and but everyone has something, everyone has been exposed to it, everyone has lived their life through their own experience, and unlearning, we definitely have to have grace, but we also have to hold ourselves accountable.
Great. Gotta have both.
Yeah. And so those are some like quick hitters that I think could have big payback for folks listening that are just trying to figure out what they can do, that maybe are like, I can't change my company's entire policy around talent acquisition. Like, I can't do that. These are some small things you can do in the meantime that I think will make a big difference.
Yeah, I'm gonna pick two of the ones you say. I'm gonna speak directly to my people leaders. Coming from a people leader, I know
Yeah.
that you have a lot on your plate, but I know there's sometimes when I show up in a staff meeting or strategy meeting, but I may not be 100% myself. Those, if you are, I'm going to call it person in the minority, I'll leave it really broad. For me, a woman, you have to show up, right? And you have to make sure. And even when I'm tired that day, I'm like, I'm not showing up for me. I'm showing up for all those people that work their butt off every day who don't have the seat at the table that I have. So
Right.
that's when you can, a lot of those conversations is when, to your point, those roles say, hey, this role is going to be open in this group over here. Do you guys know of anybody who might be interested? It doesn't require the people leader to do it, but I'm going to pick on my people leaders and say,
Yeah.
hey, you need to be thinking about who on your team or who have you seen on an adjacent team that you think would be good.
Yeah.
I
And
think you
also
have to do
bake
that.
into your performance, like if you are a people leader and you have direct reports and you provide feedback to them, if their names are not coming to front of mind when you are asked those questions, that is an invitation to coach, mentor, and grow that individual. Why are they not the first person I think of when an opportunity comes up? Are they new? Are they green maybe? Do they need more training? If they're more experienced, is that what they want out of their career? If it is, what am I doing or not doing as their leader to help them get there? And then you
Yeah,
engage in those conversations. Like Jill said, you
absolutely.
talk to your people. So, look at those things as invitations. Yes, I can sponsor, but if I'm not willing to sponsor my people or the people around me, ask yourself why that is and what you can do and what you can
Agreed.
leverage to help them get there.
And then I think people leaders, even though you're a leader, regardless if you have people that report to you,
Exactly.
I think you carry a lot of weight in meetings. So I think one of the things I'm personally working on is, speaking last, but also watching how the conversation gets distributed amongst people.
Mhm.
And to your point, you got to know the people in the room, but trying to pull people out that aren't, have good ideas that just aren't saying
Yeah,
anything, right? And so I
right,
think the interrupting thing is 100%, but I also think as a people leader, you've got to watch the conversation and try to
right.
pull people into the conversation that may be a little bit more reticent.
Right. Well, and sometimes those that are more reticent haven't had the ability to build their confidence with that yet because it either has not, maybe they're newer and they don't have the confidence yet, or their confidence has been shaken by really negative experiences. And I'm speaking from experience. Um, and all it takes is a kind, supportive leader to help build that back up and give them positive experiences in places like that. Hey, you had a really great idea so and so earlier. Would you mind bringing that in front of everybody? And you do kind of put them on the spotlight, but then you support them through that conversation. If they're interrupted, you redirect it back. If their idea gets shot down, you kind of, like you said, as a people leader, you're there to manage group think. You're there to ask the tough questions. You're there to encourage. And then you're there to say, hey, look, just because every idea doesn't get enacted doesn't mean it wasn't important that we hear it, because that just
Yep.
probably sparked another idea. So yeah, I love how you said that. As a people leader, you need to be able to kind of manage the room equitably, even in that little space, right? It's another
Yep.
small thing somebody can do without trying to tackle the biggest thing at their organization.
Yep. We've talked a lot today. So on Daryl Anne on your sheet, I'm going to skip a couple questions.
Sure.
As you heard Jill mention, we're nearing International Women's Day, where it's actually before it. As we're recording this, when we release it, it will be after it. The theme this year, if you don't already know, is accelerate action. So I'm curious, Daryl Anne, which is why I skipped to this question, what that means to you, and how do you think women can accelerate action in their workplaces and communities?
Absolutely. So I might have a little bit of a different approach to this question.
All right, I love it.
Which I
Bring it on.
love. We need it. Women have been doing the work. Diverse individuals, disenfranchised folks, minorities, however you want to classify that. We have been doing the work for so long just to protect autonomy, agency, having a place, trying to operate within the systems and still survive and go home and be able to take care of ourselves and our families and our friends and our communities. And so when I hear the word accelerate action, to me, I'm hearing that action has already been taking place. And the systems that action has been taking place are not allowing for progress. We talked about the gender pay gap and there not being
Yeah.
a difference in the last 20 years. So when I hear accelerate action, I'm hearing that that's an invitation for those that aren't at the table, at our table, who aren't experiencing that, who have the place of power, privilege, everything. They need to step in. They need to step up, and they need to take accountability for the ways that their actions or lack of actions have been contributing to the harm or contributing to the gaps. And again, like you said, you can have grace with yourself. I understand that a vast majority, nobody's intending harm. Nobody wakes up every day and says, you know what, I really want to screw over some people today. There's some that do. I think we all
I
have
hope
a few
not.
that
I hope
come
there's
to
very
mind.
few people on that list.
But in our general day-to-day, like for the most part, people tend to err on the side of good. They really do. And they're just trying to do the best they can with what they know. But that doesn't relieve us of, right? Your intention doesn't override impact. So when I hear that, to me, accelerate action means we have got to link arms with every single ally, and they need to show up to make these changes actually drive progress, because we've been fighting and fighting and fighting, and we're in a tug of war against something that is immovable, right? These systems are immovable without help. And so we need them to join us. So
And we invite them to join us because we want you at the party, right?
we want you here. And I say
Yep.
that with so much love and care and compassion, because the outcome that I want to see is that when we fight for the most disenfranchised, when we look around and we say, hey, how can I make it better for women? And then, plug in whatever intersectional identity you want to within that. How do I make this space better for folks in the disability community? How do I make this space better for, people of color? How do I make this space better for women? Regardless of the identity, the group that you're trying to advance and make better, you are inevitably going to make everyone's experience better.
Yeah.
Right?
I think you really see that in the disability community, like things that
Absolutely.
are invented or maybe done a different way to accommodate somebody who has a different ability.
Absolutely. I mean, you
It
think
benefits
about
everyone.
exactly. And I, just a couple quick examples of that I've recently seen and tried to lead change myself, so I can hold myself accountable to the audience too, is, in our industry, we have to wear PPE across construction, manufacturing, whatever side of the industry you find yourself on, you're always going to have to wear PPE. And women have anthropometric differences in our measurements. We absolutely do, but all of the garments and the PPE has been based off of men's data and metrics. And so recently we were able to spark a conversation within our organization, and we have women on our safety leadership side. So we have safety, environmental health and safety managers who are women, and they said, we have got to start looking at some different options because we kind of have a one size fits all. And so we started with our safety vest. And they went out of their way to pilot several models of safety vests that were specific to women, designed with women in mind. They then brought that back to our Women's Partner Resource Group. And then the Women's Partner Resource Group amplified that out. We brought in Radiance, who's the manufacturer. We brought in Fastenal, who was a vendor. We had them come in and speak to our partner resource group, our employee resource group, and have them educate us on the data and the facts around women's PPE. And during that conversation, we invited our production leadership and our executive leadership into the conversation. And we had several folks show up. And I got no less than 5 phone calls after that conversation from men in leadership positions saying, I had no idea that something as simple as a safety vest could restrict or cause discomfort or cause actual safety risk to y'all in the field. I had no idea. Now I do.
I have to admit, I had no idea. I've worked in
Yep.
manufacturing, and so for me, mostly it was safety shoes, which you
Yep.
can argue you have to get women's size safety shoes for the most part.
Absolutely.
But when you get out of that and maybe safety glasses, which is
Yeah,
what
there's limited conversations around it. It's
I had no
happening.
idea.
But
And then you put the whole pregnancy thing on top of it, right? If somebody's
absolutely
pregnant with child, and they're
absolutely
obviously that's sort of a temporary, I hate to call it disability, but it's a temporary problem
Right.
that,
And you have to provide accommodations, because the reality is that you are going to have pregnant people in your organization and in our industry that do go out into the field, and we are required to protect them. And I wouldn't even care if we were required to or not. We should. And there are accommodations, and there are folks out there that are making those garments that are safer based on those, data-driven anthropometric measurements for women and providing those options. But I specifically brought that up because once we did that from a woman's perspective, that we needed to have this as a woman's issue, it started to garner conversation around different size bodies, regardless of your gender. Regardless of where you fall on the gender spectrum, there are bodies that are smaller or different shaped than the traditional metrics, the traditional measurements. And so many different groups and types of people have been sacrificing on safety to wear something that's a one size fits all. So now we have an option that not just women can wear. It might be a woman's vest, but it was designed so intentionally that many different types of folks can wear it. And now we have options from small to 3X, I believe, that have some intentionality in the design and can be worn by many different body types. So by advocating through this one piece of equipment, or PPE, personal protective equipment, through this one woman's issue, we've now created a more safe environment for everyone. And that starts to lead us into conversations around fall protection. Some of the most dangerous situations that our industry gets put in, which is working at heights or working around equipment and machinery, you have to have the fall protection or the, whatever that looks like. So now we're starting to get into conversations around measurements and body data around properly fitting fall protection. Some things like access to restrooms, right? We've gone on job sites. We've seen the porta potty situation. We've gone to offices or manufacturing facilities that, to your point, there are pregnant people in the world. There are also nursing people in the world, and there's no mother's room or there's no clean access to a safe facility. So those are other things that we can look at. And guess what? I promise you, there's not a person on the planet, regardless of gender, that would be like, oh, you gave me a nicer bathroom? Take it back. I don't want it. Right?
Yeah.
The more accessible, the more safe, the more clean, and the more comfortable, it's going to make everyone's lives better. And so that's another message I hope people take away is and to Jill's point too, when we invest in people, we're helping everyone. It's not just a woman's issue. It's not just a disability issue. It's not just a race issue. When we make accommodations and we create safety, physical, mental, psychological, across all different spectrums and intersectionalities, we are making it better for everyone. And when we make it better for everyone, we are going to see the business results because of that. Dozens and dozens, if not hundreds of studies have been done on this, and it gets proven out every single time.
Well, Daryl Anne, it's hard to believe that we are at the end of our time today. It's so much fun. But I do want to ask you the last piece of question that I love to ask, which is, what is one piece of advice or quote around gender equity this time that you want to share with our audience?
I've got 3, but I'm going to go very fast. The first one is never internalize feedback that fundamentally makes you unsure of who you are. Yes, be teachable and always look for ways to improve, but understand that not everyone is qualified to provide you with feedback that's relevant to your growth.
Feedback is a gift. You can choose to take it or let it go. Yeah.
Take it or leave it. And then the next one is nice is not the same thing as kind. Nice is not the same thing as ethical. Nice is not the same thing as moral. And the older I get, the less interested I am in nice, because nice is the gift wrap. It says nothing about what's inside. And that comes from Cora Harrington. And I chose that one because I think oftentimes women are taught that they have to be nice, and that niceness is politeness, and that niceness is you are small and quiet and you meet the expectations of those in the room and you don't take up a lot of space. And I think distancing ourselves from the word nice and how we've been taught to interpret it and replacing it with the word kind, which also includes, I owe it to you as a person who, is worthy and valuable to give you this feedback. Don't talk to me that way. Or, I reject that feedback, or I'm asking for a raise. Kindness is also having authority in the conversation and enacting your authority and pushing it forward, without being polite for the sake of being polite. So, and again,
I love
that was
that
by
one.
Cora Harrington. And then the last one, I love this one, is from Audre Lorde. If what we need to dream to move our spirits most deeply and directly towards and through promise is discounted as luxury, then we give up the core, the fountain of our power, our womanness. We give up the future of our worlds. So when women are taught that the things we enjoy and the things that we are inherently and intrinsically good at, or the things that we need to do to rejuvenate, to find peace, comfort, and safety in the environments that we are thrust into and the systems that we have to operate into, if we are taught that those things are luxury, or they're silly, or that they're girly, or there's any sort of negative connotation with them. And of course, Audre Lorde was speaking so much more deeply. I'm trying to keep it high level for the sake of the conversation. We give up our right, we give up our space, we give up our womanness, we give up our power within that. And then we slide back into conformity, right? So
we give up our uniqueness, which is what diversity is all about, actually.
right.
Well, Daryl Anne, it's been so much
our
fun. I feel like I
differences.
wish we could go back to that stage and do it all over again. It was so much fun.
I know. I like daydream about having more time and maybe one more person on the panel too, right? And you're such an incredible facilitator, and obviously you have such a great perspective and all the things. Like it would be great to just have an open dialogue and see where it goes. And I think it would be so powerful. So I look forward to many more conversations and all the different ways that empowering women, provides platforms for. So thank y'all so much. And thank you to the audience. Love you guys. Thank you for listening.
Agreed. She couldn't have said it better. Thank you guys for listening. I will see you again next month. Bye, everybody.